In this video, we take a look at the so-called GetContactsTask, which is a private nested class inside of class address book that extends the AsyncTask generic class from the Android.os package. Now, the AsyncTask class is designed to help you perform some task in a separate thread of execution and return results to a GUI thread of execution. Now, there's three type parameters that are specified for an async task. In our case, we used object, object, and cursor. And let's first talk about what the purpose of each of these three type parameters is. Now, the first one is the type that you're going to use for the variable length argument list of the doInBackground method. Now, the doInBackground method is the method in which you define the task to be performed in a separate thread of execution, and when you say to execute a GetContactsTask, the doInBackground method is what's going to be called first at that point. Now, the second argument is also defined as object in this case, and by the way, the reason we used object is because we're actually not passing any arguments to the doInBackground method in this example. What we're doing is simply executing the task. It didn't need any arguments to perform that task. So if, for example, you had a task that required some string value in order to be performed properly, you could specify string here, and then that would become the type of the variable length argument list for doInBackground. And if you had multiple strings, you could pass in multiple strings or a single string if you needed to. Now, for the second type parameter, we're also using object in this example because we're not going to take advantage of it. And this is the data type of the variable length argument list that's passed to the so-called onProgressUpdate method. Now, we're not overriding the onProgressUpdate method in this example, but if we had overridden it, it would be a way to get intermediate results back from the separate thread of execution that's performing the task. In our case, we just want the final results, so we're only going to override doInBackground to perform the task and onPostExecute to get the results back in the GUI thread when the task completes. Now, the last argument is the type of the value that will be passed to onPostExecute, and that is the results of the doInBackground method. So basically what's going to happen here is when we execute a GetContactsTask, doInBackground will get called. It will open up our database connector that we're creating up above here, and we'll talk about that again in a moment, and then it's going to return a result of getting all the contacts from the database connector. That's all happening in a separate thread of execution. Then automatically, when the doInBackground method completes, in the GUI thread of execution, onPostExecute will get called, and that's where we will then take the cursor results and bind them to our list view in the address book activity. So when we create the new GetContactsTask, we first create the instance variable database connector as a new database connector using this address book activity as the context in which the database will be manipulated. The doInBackground method returns a cursor, which is again the result that's going to be passed into onPostExecute, and it takes a variable length object array called params as its argument, and you saw back up here in the onResume method that we passed in null because we didn't have any arguments for this task to use. So going back down to GetContactsTask, we ignore this parameter in the doInBackground method for this particular case. Now, database connector is the last class we'll look at in this example, and basically it encapsulates all the interactions with the database in the example so that we can simply call methods of our database connector to perform the tasks. So first thing we do is create the new database connector, and again it's being manipulated in the address book activity, so that's the context. Then in the doInBackground method, we open a connection to the database, and as you'll see, this method is going to get a so-called writable database, which allows us to create the database if it doesn't exist, or interact with the database for both reading and writing if it does exist. And at line 76, we're then going to return the result from this method of calling database_connector.getAllContacts. And as you'll see, that's going to query the database to get all the names of the contacts in the database, and that method will return a cursor object, which in turn will be passed into onPostExecute when doInBackground finishes executing. Now the overridden onPostExecute method receives the cursor. That's the third type parameter that's specified when we extend AsyncTask. And when this method gets called, it will automatically be called specifically in the GUI thread of execution. So at that point, we can interact with our contact adapter and tell it to change its cursor to the result that we just got, which presumably could also include updated data that was stored in the address book. And at that point, we can then close the database connector because we're no longer going to be interacting with the database. We're simply going to use the cursor to populate the data in the list view. One other thing I should point out, when you have an async task, once you execute it, you cannot re-execute it. So every single time you want to perform the GetContactsTask, you create a new object of this class, call its execute method to perform the task, and as soon as that's done, the object is no longer usable. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons back up here in onResume that we didn't assign the reference returned by new to a variable, because we just want it to go away once the task has finished.